Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this morning's webinar on employee offboarding. My name's Lindsay and I'm a director at Heads Together Consulting. And I'm really excited and delighted to be running the webinar this morning in partnership with Ian Topping, who you can see hopefully as well from Allsop. I'm just briefly going to talk to you a little bit about what Heads Together do, and then I'll ask Ian to do the same about Allsop, and then we'll get into the webinar this morning. In terms of Heads Together, we are an independent HR consultancy. We're based in Hollywood and we employ a team of 10 people. And really our services are across 3 areas. We provide specialist consultancy support, dealing with complex and strategic HR issues. We also provide day-to-day HR support for small and medium-sized organisations who may not have any internal HR resource or who may need some more capacity or some more specialist support. We also have Train Together, and I am in our training suite this morning, not doing as much face-to-face training, and everything is virtual as we know, but we do provide a range of workplace training solutions. And really it is focused on developing the capability and the confidence of managers and leaders in their careers. Ian, would you like to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about Allsop?
Sure, thank you very much, Lindsay. It's great to join you today on this webinar here, unfortunately on the subject of offboarding, but a very important subject nonetheless. At Allsop, we pride ourselves on making working lives better with digital workflow. Within the HR environment, we appreciate the sensitivity of data. We also appreciate there's a number of pains within each department, whether it's HR or others, and we listen to those and we try to facilitate and remove those pains, as I say, to make working lives better. We're a Belfast-based company. We have 26 staff. We've all been working from home since March. All our guys are typically coding and development guys, so they're quite happy to be sitting at their computer working that way. But basically we listen to professionals in the sector and we put in place a digital workflow. So professionals like yourself, Lindsay.
Thank you, Ian. So the webinar this morning, we are going to cover 5 key considerations of offboarding. We will probably run for about 40 minutes or so, and you of course have the option to ask questions. Depending on how you logged on, whether it was through PC, laptop or tablet, you should be able to see a Q&A button. So please feel free to submit a question. If you want to do it anonymously, just remember to tick the little box to send your question in anonymously. And Ian and I will both keep an eye on the questions and we will certainly answer any as we work through. So I suppose a good place to start is, what is employee offboarding? And we all will be very familiar with the term onboarding. And I think most organisations put a lot of energy and a lot of resource into that onboarding process and setting somebody up for success. That's from payroll to making sure that they have the right equipment, the right access, that there are clear lines of communication, they have their objectives, they hit the ground in a way that they can absolutely get going and hopefully do a really good job. And we spend a lot of energy looking at that process. Offboarding is very simply, I suppose, the opposite end of that process, where an employee is leaving the organisation. And it's looking at how we can make that process as efficient and as effective as our onboarding process. And we'll talk as we go through the webinar about some of the reasons why that is critically important for an organisation. And then from a technology perspective, how can technology support that offboarding process?
I think, as you say there, Lindsay, it is very much a support mechanism. The technology is there to mimic the process of our clients. Each company will have their portals, their the process of application and recruitment portals. They'll have their HR applications, they'll have their payroll applications. Yeah. And basically we put a digital workflow layer across the top of that to ease the automation of collaboration between the departments. By producing that layer, we give a full audit trail, and I'll talk later about how the audit trail is vitally important when people are offboarding and onboarding. And fundamentally, we're there to protect all involved. So when there is an offboarding situation, a difficult situation where somebody's leaving the company, we need to facilitate that. We need to facilitate it for process of the business as well. And as I say, take direction from HR. Fundamentally, where the company's concerned, we need to remove any risk of data breach. As an employee, you have access either to buildings or to technology. You have access to assets, company assets, etc. With the audit trail, we can remove the risk of data breach in a timely fashion, and we'll show how technology can be actioned on a date. But as you rightly say, it's a critical stage within the business, and we're just providing the technology, Lindsay, to support the processes as you outlined.
Super, Ian, thank you. And it is quite timely. I mean, you don't need me to tell you all what's been in the news. We all know what's been in the news, and we continue to work in a really strange environment, don't we? And I think from an offboarding perspective, Ian and I will both touch on this, that presents other opportunities and challenges with offboarding, because most of us are in either a hybrid situation where we're part office, part home, or a lot of us are just at home. And when you don't have that physical contact with people, making sure that you have a slick offboarding process becomes even more important. Redundancies, there are mass redundancies. It's at a record high, as you can see from those headlines. And we obviously had the very last minute change to furlough, didn't we? Where we would have seen, and you will have seen, a lot of redundancies being made in the run up to the 31st of October. That scheme has now been extended further. But the view from a lot of people is it's maybe too little, too late, and there's going to be a significant rise in unemployment. And, you know, from my perspective, and I can only speak from my perspective, but with the clients that we work in across all three sectors, public, private, and not-for-profit, we are seeing a bit of a mass exodus from the workplace, which is quite sad, and certainly not something that I would have experienced before. I had the joys of working in retail back in 2008, and it wasn't a patch on what certainly we're experiencing now. And because of the extent of the redundancies being made, fixed term contracts being brought to an early finish, probationary periods being terminated, we do naturally have a lot of people leaving organisations. So Ian and I felt it was timely to focus this webinar on offboarding. And offboarding, as hopefully we'll share with you today, it's critical at any time because it absolutely protects your organisation. And from a more qualitative perspective, it also ensures that we keep the organisation's reputation intact, and ultimately people leave with a really positive, lasting impression of their employer. I would like to, while we have a bit of an audience, I'm always really interested to see what other organisations are doing. I would like to ask some questions to get a sense of what you're doing at the moment. So I have some questions for you. First one being, have you experienced any issues when an employee leaves your organisation? Those could be payroll issues, company property not being returned. So if you want to give us some sort of insight, whether you've experienced issues or not. Second question, does your organisation currently have a defined offboarding process? Yes or no? And the last question, for those that do have a defined process, is any aspect of it automated? And I can see you all voting, which is wonderful, and then we'll share the results. Okay, I will assume that everybody has voted. We have stopped the count, so that normally is a good insight that everybody who wants to vote has voted. Okay, so hopefully you can see the results on your screen now. So 50% of people on the webinar this morning have experienced an issue when an employee leaves, which, yeah, I would expect. I suppose I think there are a lot of issues that can happen when an employee leaves. 63% have a defined offboarding process at the moment. And out of those that have a defined process, 50% have an element of it automated, which I think is quite interesting, Ian, isn't it? That, you know, 50% are using technology to kind of automate those offboarding processes at the moment.
Yeah, it is very reassuring to see. It's funny to see it split at the top at the first
Yeah.
question there. But to have a defined employee offboarding process from a technology perspective, we're just interested in processes and rules. We're quite dull individuals. And if there are rules, then we can reflect that in the software. And it creates triggers, which we'll talk about later. But it's also good to see that the offboarding process is being automated. There's a lot of really good HR software available, a lot of cloud-based HR software available that is not expensive, that does have good workflow processes or good stages in it that makes sure individuals are aware that things have to happen. The layer we put on top of that is just automation.
Super.
It's really, really interesting. Really
It's
interesting.
interesting. I always love poll questions. I think they're very interesting to get a bit of insight. Okay, so the 5 key considerations that Ian and I are going to focus on is really looking at the benefits of having a defined and potentially automated offboarding process. And the first aspect I want to focus on is about managing risk. And really, when I think of risk and offboarding, it is in 2 perspectives. It's legal risk and from an employment perspective, and also commercial risk. And legal risk, and we're back to basic principles. I appreciate this is very first principle information, but it's making sure that whatever has been the catalyst for the departure is a stored document, whether that's a resignation letter, whether that's a dismissal letter, whether that's a notice of redundancy letter. And that might sound like a very obvious thing, but at times that can slip through the nets, particularly when you're dealing with a lot of people that are leaving an organization. And your offboarding process, if that document is absolutely mandatory that we have that in place, that then starts a sequence of events, doesn't it, in terms of payroll, in terms of what the leave date is there notice due, is there not notice due, perhaps with a summary dismissal, what about the holiday balance? And we are seeing now quite a few challenges about unlawful deduction of wages where there has been an element of dispute about final monies. And quite often when we trace that back with the client, we've not got something concrete about when that person was leaving the organisation. And there was one case that sticks in my head where an employee had given a verbal resignation. And the manager, rightly so, had said, you need to put that in writing, which would be a standard approach, wouldn't it, when somebody gives a verbal resignation. And for whatever reason, life gets busy, work gets busy, that written resignation was never received. And this employee was a bit of a problem employee. Fast forward, he gets his P45, and he then tried to challenge that actually the company had dismissed him, that he was just having a bad day. He'd thrown the head up and said, I'm not coming back. And that the company had acted upon that, and by processing him as a leaver had essentially dismissed him. Now, that did get resolved. However, there was a lot of time, a lot of resource, and a lot of expense to go into tracing something back, which by having a document in place could have been avoided. Commercial risk then, and I think Ian and I will both touch on this much more significantly as we go through, but making sure we understand if there is a commercial risk when somebody is departing an organisation. And we've got things, most of us will have clauses in our contracts about restrictive covenants. Some of us will use garden leave where we may feel it's prudent that the individual doesn't work their notice period and that they essentially are at home for the duration and the remainder of their employment. And I worked in a case a couple of years back where this really brought this commercial risk home. And it was a very senior manager in a company, a well-known company in Northern Ireland, who tendered their resignation. And this person was a problem employee, as we've all come across. So the directors very willingly accepted the resignation and didn't want to poke it because they didn't want this guy to change his mind. They were quite glad to see the back of him. He then continued to work out his 3-month notice period. And what happened in that 3-month period would terrify the life out of you because he siphoned a huge amount of customer information. So there's alarm bells. I'm sure at Ian's perspective from data breach, a huge amount of customer information went missing. That then in turn translated into over £1 million worth of business being essentially taken. And what the organisation hadn't done was they hadn't really sense checked, was there a commercial risk? Because this individual was actually going to set up a company in direct competition with his employer. And had they have known that, they probably and should have put him on garden leave, immediately limited his access. But by the time they realised, it was essentially too late. So by having an offboarding process and making sure we have our checks and balances in place, making sure, and we'll touch on it later on, we have exit interviews, we understand the reason for the departure, it is mitigating against that commercial risk. And even where we have to put people in garden leave or remind them of their responsibilities under a restrictive covenant, most of us will know on the call, that can be really hard to enforce a restrictive covenant. But the first step is absolutely to remind somebody of their responsibilities in that regard. And from a technology perspective, how can that risk be managed?
I think the key element of risk comes down to all of the human beings that are involved in the process. And the more humans we have in the process, the more opportunity for natural error or for them to overlook something, as you talked about, in busy lives. So from a very outset, when somebody comes into the business, and what we're looking at here is a typical screen of our software, but when somebody comes into the business, there's a process of, as we talked about, onboarding them, and we capture the employee details. The same employee details are then passed electronically back into their HR application. Other information is then shared based on security levels. So an employee information is maybe shared with the IT department to give them access to the systems. But the IT department will not get the payroll information and sensitive stuff, all outlined by HR professionals like yourself, Lindsay, as part of the process. But if you imagine that you've got the HR putting in employee information, maybe the head of the department's putting in the job role, maybe somebody else is dealing with the property security, somebody else is dealing with IT, and therein lies the inherent risk of all those different people and all of them remembering to do something. So as you say about the resignation, the verbal resignation, and the letter was overlooked and busy lives, etc. So we typically provide an environment that once the process starts, it has to be signed off by all individuals, and you have to approve that you've received all that correspondence. So if you have your resignation letter or your termination letter or your redundancy process, all of that has to be ticked, that we have that, and that we have that in our HR, and that all of those departments are aware of it, and they're all aware of the date that the person or people will be leaving the business, so that all access can be closed out. As soon as we have a date for a leaver, that date is then added to the system and it flows right through. So it's really just about collaboration and ensuring that all of the necessary steps are recorded. And as you mentioned there, of all the time wasted searching for something, there's a vast amount of clutter. There's a vast amount of sensitive information that's shared via email, and email is not secure. We had a company, a customer of ours in the south of Ireland, where their IT guy was siphoning off information. He had access to all email. So when he saw any type of title in a subject matter, he was then siphoning that information off, knowing it had to do with human resources. So he was siphoning off payroll information. They eventually brought in a company to do a lot of forensic investigation at huge expense. The individual was then put in gardening leave. The process extended through 9 months of full pay leave until that individual could then eventually see the evidence stacking against them. And in order for that individual to exit the business, he asked for a reference to go quietly. Otherwise, he was going to counterclaim against the business. If they had our digital automation in process, there would be no security breach via email. The platform would share information, and it only shares information that's relevant to the department. So it's all about security, mitigating risk. And then as we'll talk later about the commercial risk, but as people leave the business, making sure that they don't have access still to sensitive information. But fundamentally, Lindsay, it's all about us working closely with HR. As I say, we're not HR experts, and we're very grateful to be on your webinar today, of where you're sharing this vital professional knowledge. And then we just come along, listen to what the pains and problems are, and we put in place this integrated digital workflow.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ian. I think a lot of us on the call will have experienced some issues when somebody leaves with access, which Ian has talked about in terms of the chap who was still siphoning off emails after his departure, and return of company property. And I think depending on the role, there will be some roles that have more technology. They might have iPads, they might have phones, they might have laptops, and also long-serving employees that can build up with time. And quite often we come across organisations naturally, through no fault of their own, with the best of intentions, that don't have an accurate inventory of what an employee has. And that can become quite problematic, can't it, when somebody leaves? Because what does the employee have? How do we know that they have that? And who is going to be responsible for getting that company back? And I remember years back in one of my very first jobs, we introduced a key fob system. Shows you how long ago that was, where it was a new system at the time, a key fob system. And our big oversight and a big learning for us was when people left, it wasn't part of our process that we naturally disabled their key fob. And we had a joyous experience one night where we had a very disgruntled former employee, and the business was a 24/7 business, who decided to come back in and run absolute amok at midnight and caused a lot of damage. And that was a real oversight on our part, that we hadn't disabled the key fob. So even simple things, it's making sure that they're built into your process. It always amazes me the amount of people that have fuel cards where that's not naturally closed down. And we're dealing with a case recently where an individual has cost the company a couple of £100 because they filled up their own car, their wife's car, their mum's car, because the fuel card hasn't been closed down. And that's now working through that process. So it's making sure that there is somebody within your organization, either through HR or through IT, that is overall responsible for what company property does this individual have, and what happens when that leave date is established, and at what point that will be closed down. There's a bit of a running joke between me and my husband, because you might remember the Christmas where it was very snowy, and we were out at our Christmas dinners with work and trying to get home for the babysitter so that the babysitter could go and we would be at home with the kids. And he got home really quickly, and I always wondered, how on earth did he get a taxi so quickly? Because I was not that far from him and I couldn't get a taxi. And I mean, a bit of a rascal, and it's just a story to kind of make the point, but he had remembered 2 companies ago what the password was for the taxi account. So he was able to get a taxi on account and get home very easily. And that's naughty, and he was very naughty to do it. But I'm sure there's a lot of people, whether it's taxi accounts, whether it's discounted car parking, it's thinking through all of those different benefits, all of the property that organization gives to an employee, and making sure that, much as we do a great job normally of giving it to the employee, that equally when an employee departs, we do remove it, and we make sure that there is a clear date where that expires or that property is returned. And from your perspective, what about technology?
Yeah, absolutely. Even just from a point of view, you list out what physical access, IT access, technology, car fuel cards, key fobs, taxi accounts, et cetera, all of those touch on different departments. And all of those departments maybe aren't fully aware of the person joining, leaving, promoting, etc. There's one customer, obviously remain nameless, but she was complaining to me that HR only know about a new start whenever payroll come to them and say, so-and-so has just added a new starter, are you aware of them? And then HR have to go to that department head and go, I believe so-and-so has started. What's the role? What's all the detail involved? employee information, all of that very sensitive data that should have been presented at the outset. But due to busy lives, they just went, I just want somebody to start and I want to make sure they're paid so they stay. After that, we'll worry about HR afterwards and it's forgotten about. So it's the automation and integration of all of those departments to make sure everybody's aware somebody is joining or leaving the business. On the screen we have here, you can see that we have an end date or a leaver date or whatever terminology the company requires. That's our trigger. That's where we drop back into our rules. And based on that date, we might book an exit interview. We may help with all of the scheduling of that, but fundamentally what we definitely will do is we will run off in the background and we will close down all of the access. So me, hands up, back in the day, previous employer, city centre company, I had access to the car parking. I had access to the taxi account and still do to this day, 5-6 years later. And I had access to Microsoft's partner portal, which was the most sensitive piece. And it was only months later after leaving them, I thought, I wonder, can I still get in? And I typed in the URL and I put in my username and password, and hey presto, up comes all of their pricing, discounting, promotion, all of that data. Now I'm very friendly with the owner of the business, and the owner is quite happy for me to park in his car park at weekends, not during the week, but at weekends, and is more than happy for me to use the taxi if on the odd occasion I'm actually out. With 4 children, it's not very often, but if I'm actually out, Paul's quite happy for me to use the taxi. But I had to make him aware all those years ago, I still had access to Microsoft's portal and all that sensitive information. And he then went through a girl in Dublin who then got all of that cancelled. But it's making sure that on that date, we're passing the information to all of the relevant departments, and all of those departments can act on that date, and they can remove access to Office 365. They can remove access to those partner portals, etc. We've one current customer who will remain nameless as well, and they had a big rationalization last year. They had a big headcount of sales, remote sales team, field sales guys that were all put on notice of risk of redundancy. So a lot of them then polished up their CVs, went looking for jobs, and a number of them were able to take a package and move as part of the process. But in moving, they moved to competitors in the type of industry they're in. They know that industry really well, and they tend to move within competitors. Now, when they moved and they had a leaving date and they had an exit and so on, they didn't close down pricing mechanisms. They didn't close down order portals. And for a number of weeks, all of that data was wide open to those individuals in their new roles. That's not possible today. As soon as you put a leaver date in there, it knows that user's name and it knows the user access across the entire state of IT, and it'll close all of that. And as well as that, it also, because we've brought them in through the process, we have a full audit trail of the assets they own. So we know that they have got fuel cards, they've got cars, they've got fobs that'll get them into secure areas, because this is a 24/7 business. They have iPads, they've Surface Go's, they've mobile phones, they've laptops, etc. One very quick story for you. We had a bad leaver in a company, and they waited to payday. They got paid, and they then sent an email from their computer, their company equipment, to say they were leaving, and they weren't returning their equipment. The police were involved, and the first question the police asked was, give us proof of the kit that the individual has, right down to serial number. And as soon as that information was presented immediately, the police went, okay, this is theft. And it's worse than standard theft, apparently, because it's almost a breach of trust and theft. The police pursued the individual, took a criminal case against them. All of the equipment was returned. The individual has a record that'll follow him for life, unfortunately. But the company concerned got back their equipment, but more importantly, they closed the breach of data and any customer breach. As companies, we all sign up to service level agreements with our customers, and those are all about GDPR and supporting those businesses. So you must comply with your service level, and you must be able to evidence the fact that you have an audit of what's been given out, and you have an audit of what's come back, and you have a date to prove that all of it was closed. And that protects the company concerned. It protects the employee should there be a breach, they're clear of it, and it protects your customers by saying that we have this all in place. So I have many other different examples, Lindsay, but I appreciate I'm going on a bit, so I'll pass back to yourself.
I think that's really interesting, Ian. And the bit you had shared that story with me before about the serial number, and that's really stuck with me, because I think for the delegates on the call that are from smaller organizations, you know, it is a bit of a prick of the conscience in terms of, would we have that level of detail right down to serial number? And for me, that's something that I've definitely taken away. So thank you, and that's really interesting. The other aspect of offboarding, I suppose, that I want to focus on is the employer reputation and staff engagement. And we spend so much time making a really good first impression, don't we, with our new employees, and introducing them to our culture and making sure that they spend time with our kind of rising stars. And equally, it's making sure that that lasting impression and that final impression is also a positive one, especially because it's human nature. People will talk. And if the employee's departure has not been slick, if there have been bumps in the road, they will talk about that. They'll talk about it with people outside of the organisation, but they'll also talk about it with their former colleagues and quite possibly friends that are still within the organisation. So it's making sure that through a defined process and an automated process to an extent, and I think it's great what Ian is sharing with us as a very non-technological person. It's very interesting to hear how this can become much slicker with technology. I think it's removing that potential for oversight and error so that there aren't bumps in the road. And we at Heads Together have been working with a client who have had to make mass redundancies, unfortunately, and it's been a very difficult process. And the employees in question have a very long amount of service. Each person would have over 20 years. So you can imagine that was wrought with emotion. They're a heavily unionized organization. So we had worked really hard with the client to make that consultation process, and unfortunately the dismissal process, as positive's the wrong word, but as effective as possible. And we kind of got the staff to a place where they were okay. We were giving them really good outplacement support, somewhere, you know, set up to attend interviews. So it was kind of going well as these things can go. And then they processed final payments, and it was just an unmitigated disaster. Payments were wrong, holidays were wrong. It was an insolvency situation, so they were having to complete RP1 forms, wrong information was sent out, missing information. Then they had to get company property back. They didn't know what employees had, what they didn't have. And it has just left a really sour taste in everybody's mouth. And I think for me as an HR professional, I absolutely will look much more closely at offboarding as part of a redundancy process, because I think you can put a lot of effort and energy into a process, but actually making sure that that person leaves and they get paid the right amount, they have the information that they need to claim through redundancy payment services, they know what company property they're giving back and when. That's really important, and really important for employees. And the opposite of that happens as well, where, you know, if you get this right, and it's great to see so many of you have that defined process already, if it's slick, if people receive what they need to receive when they should be receiving it, when it's been a very joined up approach, it leaves a really positive lasting impression. And that can hopefully result in some boomerang employees, maybe people who have said, I'm going to leave, I'm going to have a new go at a different type of job, a different career. And if that doesn't work out, if they hold you in high regard because your processes have been slick and they have felt valued, you might get them coming back. And that's a great testimony, isn't it, to you as an employer, when you've people that want to come back to your organization. And then I suppose from a technology perspective, that can definitely be supported, can't it, in terms of keeping the reputation and keeping those level of engagement high?
Yeah, absolutely, Lindsay. I have to say, with working with the HR departments, I found all of the departments to be very conscious of the employee's best outlook, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So on occasion when I will joke politically incorrectly. I'm put in my place by those HR professionals as to the right approach that should be in place for the employee. So the HR department are totally driven at looking after the employee, and they want the best for the employee, whether it's bringing them on or them exiting. And bringing them on, they want the employee to come through the door and feel loved immediately, so everything's available for them immediately. And likewise, leaving, they want to make sure that everything's in place for that individual so that they can go to their next job, so that they have all that paperwork that they need. The unfortunate side of it is that there's many departments involved in both onboarding and offboarding. And in the offboarding process, there can be some maybe other department heads who have slightly different motives, and they're now concerned about the output of that department. They're maybe a little unhappy that the individual is leaving and going to a competitor. So there's a bias, there's a human bias, whether we admit to it or not. And technology removes the bias. Technology doesn't really care for the bias. And it basically states that this person's leaving. HR has told us the process are these steps, and we have put the steps into the workflow. And those steps will run regardless of the feeling amongst all the department heads. And it'll be always designed to have the best outcome for the employee, and therefore hold the reputation of the company at the highest level. I have to admit as well, my first job in Northern Ireland, I worked for a company, a very, very large company, global company. But in Northern Ireland, we had something like 6 or 8 field engineers. One girl who looked after all the administration and the payroll, and a managing director who ran the business. So we were sub 10 people. I got very friendly with Evelyn, who ran the place, and Glenn, who was the MD. And the following month after leaving, I still got paid. And I thought, this is great. I'm a young man. I have no money. And you're left with that conscious decision as to whether you put your hand up, admit to it. And I have to say, there was different motives, one of which I was concerned PAYE were going to maybe hang me because I was getting paid by 2 people in this month. But I phoned Glenn and said, Glenn, I've been paid. Now, they had a small Sage payroll. And because it was automated, it still paid me even though I'd left. I was the only person in that department. So when I went, there was a big hole. I wasn't replaced immediately. But the incident still occurred. So by putting in place a digital workflow, it flags that the payroll has to be changed that month. Or we can automate it if you're happy with that, and we go straight into payroll and we say payroll number so-and-so has now left the business. It's the leaving date. Therefore, when you run the payroll, it's post that, and it doesn't just automatically send out a payroll the same amount of money. And it gives HR the ability to make those calculations and do the calculations correctly and get them out to the employee. So the employee is leaving in the best possible way. And you could open the opportunity of that boomerang, as you described. Because it is automated and because it's driven by triggers, it's timely. And if there's a department dragging their heels, and we appreciate, as I said at the outset, there's a lot of pains in the HR department, where the HR department is very much seen as the person responsible for ensuring this timely process for an employee. But if we're honest, there's a lot of other departments that can hold up that process, which reflects badly in HR. We highlight that within our application so we can see where the process is run aground. We can see where the bottleneck is. We can escalate that to a line manager automatically, or we can just send an alert to that individual to say, I know you're busy, but can you please process this for us and run on through. So we're basically, with technology, we're removing the bias, and we're just literally saying, these are the steps that have to be taken, guys, have to be taken on these dates, please action them. And then that takes it right through to HR to ensure the process is as slick as they are motivated to do. And it's what I see when I speak to HR departments. Similar to yourself, Lindsay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Okay, so I think with offboarding, and probably all of us on the call, we really want to get that level of insight, don't we, about why somebody is choosing to leave the organisation. And I think most of us, and certainly organisations of a certain size, we will conduct some form of exit interview, or you might have a different term for it. And the key thing, I think, with offboarding is who conducts the exit interview, when does it happen, and where is that information stored? And what's been quite refreshing is I think there is a move away from what was becoming a bit of a tick box with an exit interview, where you nearly ran through a series of questions, right? That's it, done. I can tick that box off the checklist or on the system to say that I've done it. And there is a move towards a much more qualitative approach where we actually want some really good information on how would you describe the culture at the organization? What were your top 3 things? What would you change? There's much more insightful information being gathered. And where I see organizations doing this aspect of offboarding really well is that that information is stored centrally, so that if somebody else from that same department leaves 3 months, 6 months, 9 months down the line, that information collectively can be assimilated. There can be some sort of analysis to look at, is there a trend? Is there an issue with our rate of remuneration on our benefits package? Is there a trend that people are going to a certain competitor? Is there an issue with a particular line manager? Is there an issue with culture? Do people not feel that they're able to progress? So it's a really good touch point as part of your offboarding process that you have a really good mechanism to gather that information. And quite often, and we will all have had this experience, if people are leaving, they will tend to be quite candid. They might also be a little bit tainted depending on the reason for their departure, but it is a good way to get some hopefully quite honest insight into what it's like to work for you as an organization. And that killer question, which I think is always really important in an exit interview, would you recommend us as a good place to work? And if the answer is no, that is a bit of a call to action, isn't it? In terms of what is amiss, what could you change, what could you do differently? And I see a lot of organizations doing this really well, and they spend the time and they really think through who is best placed to have this exit interview. What I don't always see done really well is the bringing together of the information and making sure that we can easily identify trends. And I would imagine, Ian, that's something that technology could really support, is that bringing it together collectively.
Yep, absolutely, Lindsay. And if I were to get into the technology aspect of it, it's an area I absolutely love. We're bringing on a new data stream within our business. We've got some absolutely shockingly clever young chaps coming out of university who can run algorithms across data and come back and tell you something that you never even knew to ask. It's brilliantly enlightening. And when the guys come back and they go, have you thought of this? You feel a little stupid to start with, and then you're just like, well, that's great. Thanks for that. Within our platform, we have our landing page is a dashboard, and in the dashboard, it starts to tell you of all the processes that are running, at what stage are we at, where are our bottlenecks, and where are our capacity issues. So if we've got a big, in the case with one of our customers, big rationalization of their field sales team, there was a lot of change of ownership of the business. There were a couple of people overlapping in different areas. It was a very, very big process to offboard a substantial number of people, and a substantial number of tasks need to take place. Our dashboard identifies all of the tasks that are open, and when the tasks go red, as you would imagine, they're overdue and need to be addressed immediately. It identifies that you maybe are short of resource in certain areas to process this in a timely fashion. To go back to that sort of employee reputation and staff engagement piece, if we've got a bottleneck somewhere, then it's going to make the company look bad and it's going to annoy the employees. So the heads up has to show you where you need to be focusing in order to make the process run as smoothly as possible. Trends and levers, the killer question, as you call it, and that sort of net promoter score. Again, within technology, we'll ask a question that we can give drop downs as answers. So we start to remove the bias. So yes, some people leaving are very tainted, and they'll maybe have some colorful ways of expressing how they feel, but that'll not be in a drop down list. Or maybe it's just a score, but it gives us a trend. It gives us a pattern. So as people are leaving the business, they're giving us bits of information. That's valuable information for the company to progress and grow. And we just start to plot that and present it back to the business to say, here's the feeling about the company here. a vital piece that came back was that we identified that there was a line manager that wasn't just as valuable to the company as they maybe thought. And it allowed the company to take the information and then address that with training and different other outlooks for that individual to make it better, or to move the person into a different role that better facilitated them. So in summary, yes, we have a heads-up display that focuses on this process, but underlying in that, in the data science, there's an ability to run algorithms that'll come out and shock you.
Absolutely. And kind of linked to that, I suppose, and the final point for me is about resource planning, which, if you think about what Ian has just said, it removes that bias and it becomes much more informed. And I think resource planning, we've gone from onboarding, we've offboarded employees. To complete the circle, an effective offboarding process will also inform resource planning in your organization. And, we work with some clients where that happens really well, where when somebody leaves, whether it's a prompt that there needs to be a conversation about, does a staff requisition need to be raised? Does the person need to be replaced? And it's quite timely at the moment because a lot of organizations, particularly those in the private sector, are really scrutinizing cost. So do we actually need to replace the person, or could we look at shift patterns? Could we look at extending overtime budgets and enhancing them a little bit? So it starts to become a much more objective way to resource plan, if that is that joined up approach where the system, and Ian's describing, what for a lot of us is kind of blue skies in terms of how this can work. This system would prompt a conversation with whether it's HR, operations, line management to have a think about, actually, do we need to replace the person? And therefore that could lead into a process of recruitment and selection. Or is there a different way that we can reorganize things? But I think where I see organizations do this really well is that they use all of this great information to actually make informed and objective decisions, especially at a time where costs are absolutely crucial for so many of our businesses. And Ian, I'm touching on technology, which is really wrong of me because it's not my bag at all and I don't know much about it. But I suppose from a technology perspective, that becomes much more defined, doesn't it, if it's a more automated process?
Yeah, absolutely, Lindsay. And it supports the teams on the ground. There's the decisions are being taken, maybe from a spreadsheet that basically states, we've got this number of people and we've got this level of business. Therefore, that doesn't equate. We need to take 30% of the people out of the business. And a spreadsheet then doesn't reflect the impact that has on shift patterns, on aligning demand with resources, and on it's controlling overheads, but it's not the in the trenches sort of aligning the demand, the resources against the current demand. It does hit the numbers that the senior leadership team want to hit, but then how does it practically work on the ground? And we're all about just giving that information back through HR, where HR can then say, based on these actions, this is the implication it has to the business. And then that information is shared with the department heads so that they can either go back to the customers and say, based on the current environment, this is the timelines of delivery, or this is our current capacity, so this order is being delayed. But it's all about having the information to be able to share it in such a way as to retain your good staff who now feel a little overworked, and also retain your customers. So it's just giving you the information so that you can communicate that. As we talked about right throughout the process here, that it's all about interdepartment workflow. And when HR are doing these processes, they're able to pass them back into the business. So if we say that the HR are pretty much the department in charge of the process, so HR have the requirements, we complete the automation with triggers to notify each required department, but HR are basically stating this is what's going on, whether we're bringing people on or we're taking people out of the business. Our workflow then puts that through all of the different code in the background, and it then shares that off with the different departments. And it goes back to payroll and it says it's leaving in this state, and here's what needs to be calculated. In IT, so I have a very good friend in payroll, and she was basically saying, in this day and age, if I have to enter an employee number, a sort code, an account number, a pay rate, a department. If I have to enter that into my payroll system again, I'm basically going to kill everybody in IT. Marianne is quite a good fun, and I think she might be on today, so apologies. But it's all about taking the information and passing it through to payroll and taking that repetitive task away from that department so they can do all of the professional processes they're doing. In the IT world, when you get sent through some detail about a person and their contract and their place of work, they need to maybe get a phone extension in that department, in that building. They maybe need access to Office 365. They maybe need access to a procurement portal to allow them to do their job, or access to a sales support piece. So all of these lines of business software exist, be it payroll, be it IT, be it security access into property, your HR application. And all we do is take the data, we get all the departments to ensure the data is correct. And when it's all correct and signed off, it then electronically filters through into those different applications. So you don't have to key it in. And it then comes back to HR to say that process is complete. And all of the information now resides in the software that we're all very content with, that we're all very happy with, that manages our day-to-day business. So the HR team are very happy with their HR application, I hope. And they're happy that the data in there is live. So if we revert back to one of my other stories where HR only ever knew about a new start or a leaver, and payroll would come in and say, I've got this new person in payroll, are you aware of them? Or I've been told to take this person off payroll, are you aware that all of that's been dealt with? We remove all of that hearsay. For a process to start, it has to start in our workflow and then filter through the system. The automation is huge. I think, Claire, who looks after all of this for you, will give you stats that I think one was that the 89% of employees were able to access sensitive corporate applications well after departure. All of that's removed. When you have a leaving date, the leaving date then triggers all of your software in the background to say, take them off payroll, take them out of Office 365, take them out of your accounting software, cancel the fob, cancel the petrol card, cancel the taxi. I'm just concerned, Lindsay, that husband of yours went home and didn't pick you up on the way home.
He didn't pick me up, Ian. That was most of my issue.
I would say that was his gravest pain when you were reunited that night. But fundamentally, I could whack on about technology all day and bore you all to death. We're purely about looking at your process and automating it where possible to make your working life better.
Super, Ian. Ian, thank you very much. I have found that really interesting and some really useful insight and food for thought on how technology can really support that offboarding process and make it much easier. Do we have any questions? We have had 2 questions that came in advance of the webinar. So Ian, one of them is definitely a question for you, if I can ask you. If an organisation wanted to automate their offboarding process, where do they start? What's a good starting point?
A good starting point is to think about the pain points that you currently have. What's keeping you up at night? What's really frustrating you? What makes you unhappy about going to work with regards to that process? And it all starts with HR. It's not driven by technology. It's not driven by the business. It's the HR department saying, we have this process and these are the things that are really hurting us. How can we take those out of our business? So, go back to payroll. A good friend saying to me, if I have to enter details into payroll again, I'm going to kill someone. So that's the big frustration where people are looking at it and going, surely in this day and age, with the technology the way it is, why do I have to do this task manually? Why do I have to chase X department? Or why, when somebody has been able to access a warehouse after they've left, does it come back into HR? And why do HR get the brunt of this pain when really, hold on a minute, HR have gone through the exit, they've done all the exit interviews, they've updated the HR application, they've told the departments maybe by email, or maybe there is an electronic Word document. one example of a company I was speaking to recently where they share a Word document in Office 365, and the document is there. It's got all of the steps that need to be dealt with, but there's no automation behind it. It is a good step forward. It's a digital audit of what's to be done. It can be messed with a little, but anyway, there's no triggers in it. So you're relying on somebody to log in. So I think to answer your question, Lindsay, it's really, people get really frustrated with maybe having to remind certain people within the business to do something, and they're going, enough's enough.
Yes.
I do know of people who have left companies because of technology not being good enough, and not being user friendly enough. So another point for us where we start from is people come along and go, we've got these systems, but they're big systems that are written for global companies, but they don't really do this for us. Can your stuff fix that? So shortcomings in the technology they have and shortcomings in the process.
Super, thank you, Ian. And the other question we received was who should own the employee offboarding process? And I think HR have to be the custodian of the process. I think when it comes to human resources within an organization, we do have to be the custodian. But from my perspective and my view in this would be, much as we have to be the custodian, it's really important that the key stakeholders, whether that be payroll, IT, facilities, that they are intrinsically informed in that process. And also and depending on whether you're in manufacturing, logistics, depending on your organization, maybe that has to be incorporated as part of those departments' key performance indicators, because what you measure, you manage. And if it's important that our offboarding is slick, yes, HR, the custodian, they have a responsibility in that regard, but equally they can't be the police with their big stick. There has to be a way that everybody has a joined up approach, and it's a very uniformed approach to how we deprovision and how we exit employees from the organisation. We don't have any more questions in. It is nearly 11 o'clock, so we have ran slightly over, but I do hope that you have found it interesting. Ian, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you joining the webinar today. That's been really useful.
Thank you, Lindsay.
Ian and I will be partnering up again, and we will be running some future webinars on the opposite. So we'll be talking about employee onboarding, and we'll also be talking about recruitment and selection. So we will reach out to you all and give you some details on that. We've covered quite a lot, so if you do have any questions, if you want to get in touch, please feel free, and our contact details are on the slide. We also would really love to get some feedback from you. It's the first time Ian and I have done a webinar together, so we would like to get some feedback, and you will receive a survey after the webinar, which I am reliably told takes 4 minutes. So if you can spare 4 minutes, it would be wonderful to get your feedback. So all that's left for me to say is thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Lindsay. It's been great. Thanks for having us. And please, guys, any emails, bring them out. Any questions?
Super. Thanks very much. Take care, everybody.
Thanks. Bye-bye.